And you, and you, and you, and you were there. Some of it wasn't very nice, but most of it was beautiful.
And hello, hello, hello.
Hey, Bryan, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well. To everybody out there, welcome to Dream Idiots, where each week my co host Bryan and I tell each other stories from history, from our personal lives, or from the headlines in an effort to amuse each other and hopefully you. And we are up to episode 23 today. Please check us out at our website, dreamidiots.com, where you can leave feedback for us. You can also check out, we have links to t-shirts for Dream Idiots, as well as a special t-shirt design that is supporting Everytown, Uvalde, from the recent shootings there. So you can support some folks who are in dire need of help. Thanks again for listening. We've gotten some great feedback, got a lot of feedback from the last couple of stories, which we'll be sharing at a future date. So, Bryan, how are you?
I'm doing fabulous. Got some good feedback on last couple of weeks, and we'll may have an update or two on last week's story some other time. My story has changed a little bit, but isn't quite fully resolved yet. So we'll probably come back to that at some point down the road. But definitely like and subscribe, and shoot us 5 stars if you can on whatever platform you're listening to us on. Please, that'd be great.
Yeah, I've got a 3-parter coming up today. We've got some special stuff coming up later in the summer. So thanks for sticking with us, and the best is yet to come. And Bryan, I think you are going first this week.
All righty. Well, this is going to be the first thing I share on our little program here that's actually just a silly little personal story, which hopefully you may have heard a version of this when this happened, but hopefully this has some details in it that are new. So I'm going to tell you about one summer when my blood when my blood tried to kill me. So even in the best of times, I have not necessarily been a great steward of my health. But once in the spring, way back in my 27th year, I went to my doctor. I think I was visiting for just a sinus infection. I wouldn't have thought anything of it at the time, but as I was in a doctor's office, I decided to ask him about another peculiar symptom I was having at the time. Namely, I had red dots all over my legs, tiny little dots that grew more clustered the closer you got to my ankles. Does it hurt? He asked. No. Do they itch at all? He asked. I said no again. I was wearing shorts at the time, and he touched my legs 2 or 3 times. He frowned. Long silence. Finally, he said, tell you what, finish the course of antibiotics, and if you still have these dots at the end of 10 days, you give us a call. So 10 days pass. I finished up the meds. My congestion was fabulous, but still looked a lot like someone had attacked me with a red Sharpie. So I called my doctor's office again. I was informed that my principal GP was not in that day. And in fact, he was off, I think that whole week. He was a bit older. I knew he was planning on retiring fairly soon. I jumped at the chance to see someone else, briefly explain the situation, and they said I could come in more or less immediately. And I was pretty eager to get some resolution, and frankly, also to establish a relationship with a new doctor.
Sure, so, transition time between doctors.
Sure. Right, and I was eager to find a doctor that was hopefully closer to my age. So I returned to the doctor's office the following morning on a Friday and met Dr. Carter. He was younger, scarcely older than me. He was warm, but clearly sort of in his brain. He was very thoughtful. He was calculating, but he was kind. It was clear he was willing to listen to a patient. And as a person who's perfectly willing to look stupid, I was willing to talk. So I told him my situation. It's not a long story, probably summed up in under a minute. Here's the deal. I said, I look like I have mange or something. My legs were crossed. I had shorts on again. And I quickly showed him the dots, even pulling off one shoe and sock. So dots started on my thighs a little bit, grew more numerous on my shins and calves, but my feet were basically solid red. The subtle but undeniable look of concern definitely crossed his face. He pulled on gloves, then grabbed one foot and pulled it into his lap. He said, touching my skin. He said again. Several seconds passed. He seemed to be very interested, but also kind of lost in thought. I started to say something, but before it even came out, he was a swirl of motion. He quickly looked in my eyes and my ears, then my throat. He felt my neck for a long time, then my armpits. No speaking at all. Somehow a nurse just magically appeared. Was he also telepathic? I wasn't sure. I was confused and stressed, but also slightly amused by this weird Rain Man routine. Finally, he asked me to hop down and sit on the chair adjacent. But before I could even sit down, he said, "One moment, shan't be long," and ducked out of the room, and the nurse followed him. I don't really know why she was there in the first place. Several minutes passed until he returns. His demeanor has now changed. His white lab coat was gone, and he sat down on the chair directly opposite me. And he says, "Look, I don't know what's wrong with you. I do know those red dots are bruises, tiny bruises, and lots of them." "Okay," I said, "and like all bruises, they'll just go away." He replied, "Well, no, they're symptomatic of several serious conditions. So we are going to run some tests. We're going to run a lot of tests. We're going to test you for AIDS. We're going to test you for leukemia, and we're going to test you for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. But try not to worry and have a good weekend." I laughed pretty hard and out loud at his insane request to not worry. He smiled at the stupidity of his request, just as the nurse returned. My sense of alarm really sort of only started to go off when I saw her face. She wouldn't look directly at me as she had before, and now she was just sort of ashen. Dr. Carter left the room, and I gave this nurse about a half gallon of blood. As I filled numerous vials for her, I was dumbstruck for something to say. "So, big weekend plans?" I kept silent. We wrapped up, and she pointed me toward the door. The front desk staff informed me that Carter had wanted me to return on Monday morning. So I have no memory of my weekend. I was married then. Did we see a movie? Did we stay in or eat out? Did we go for a hike? Zero idea. I was in my head about it, and told no one about all of this insanity but my wife at the time. I had dismissed AIDS as the cause, but wondered if chemo or radiation was in my future or something else. I had no idea what was in store. Monday morning rolls around. My doctor either had a really good poker face or was just permanently serious. It was hard to tell. He walked in completely expressionless. "Well," he said, and it sort of hung there forever, "you don't have AIDS, and you don't have any type of cancer as far as we can tell." "Okay," I said, "your words sound like good news, but your face is telling another story." "So we don't know why you have those bruises, so we're not done," he said. Flash forward later that day to me getting an ultrasound on my abdomen. Yes, I did ask the ultrasound tech if she could see my baby's penis. And no, she didn't laugh at all, because I'm sure she hears that joke every single day. So now I should be clear and explain that I'm a big believer in clear communication. I don't like it when people use a $10 word when a 10-cent word will do. Later that day, after scans and testing and poking and prodding, I was back in front of Dr. Carter. He explained rather proudly, "You have ITP, idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura." He looked rather pleased with himself. Let me explain this to our listeners in a fashion that is much clearer than the one he used with me. The derivation of the word idiopathic has the same derivation as the word idiocracy or idiotic or idiot. In essence, unknowing or unknown. Thrombocytopenia is simply having low blood platelets, and purpura is a small bruise. So I had low platelets causing bruises for an unknown reason. Asshole, just fucking say that. Have you ever gone to your mechanic and been told that the banging noise in the front end of your Toyota is of an idiopathic origin? Of course not. "So what's next, doc?" I said. "Lower my sugar intake. Do I eat lots of bok choy?" "Very funny," he said without laughing. So my treatment for this stupid condition is that I was on oral steroids for 4 months. My platelets rocketed way back up. The side effects of prednisone are incredible greasiness, lack of sleep, and just general bitchiness, but still better than leukemia, I suppose. I get my platelets checked occasionally, but as we will discuss later, this all happened again in my 37th year. But I'm going to hold that story for some other time. And I'm calling that an idiopathic tale.
At least you didn't come in and say, "Hey, are you down with ITP? Are you down?" I vaguely remember this, Bryan, and I remember you just being dumbstruck at the inability to figure out, bruises of an unknown origin. I mean, where are these coming? Right? I mean, that's what it is.
Right.
And I know that sounds like a Blue Oyster Cult album, but it's like, what is going on? And even then, like, someone will bring up ITP and I say, "Oh, I have a friend who has that," and they'll say, like, "Well, what is he doing for it?" And I'll actually respond with, "I don't know, because I don't know much about it, and I don't know what the prognosis is for something like that." But it sounds like it crops up every 10 years for you.
Yeah, well, at some point down the road, if I get around to it, I mean, I will tell part 2 of this story, perhaps. We'll see. So yeah, that was 97, happened again in 2007, has not happened again since, but I do check my platelets occasionally, just for the sake of caution, really. It turns out you need your platelets. But I'm fine. But I was just dumbstruck by this whole process of this doctor really, I don't know, protecting his own ego. Just tell me you don't know. Oh, it's idiopathic. Okay, great. What the fuck does that mean? So anyway.
It means you're a dumbass and it's making you sick. Well, thank you, Bryan. That's a lovely glimpse into a very scary situation.
Right. And we can shift gears a little bit. I do have, you know what time it is? It's that time of the week.
Is it time for the curse word of the week?
It is time for the Dream Idiots curse word of the week.
You are correct. So have you ever heard the term minced oath?
No, I have not.
I only learned this term recently, and I'll give you the whole. Here's the Merriam-Webster.
Minced oath. A type of euphemism based on a profanity or blasphemy that has been altered to remove the objectionable characteristics of the original expression, polite expletive.
So a minced oath, I mean, darn versus damn, gosh versus God, right? So if you're someone who cusses like Yosemite Sam and says tarnation versus damnation, all of those, shut the front door, are examples of a minced oath.
Oh, very cool.
Which is
cool.
I had never heard that term before. So, hey, just forget you, pal. Forget you when they overdub movies and try to take out.
Oh yeah.
Take out the F word or motherfudger, crap like that. So a minced oath.
That's very cool. The one that I taught. This is a weird one, but the one that came to mind for me was when someone says "zounds," which you don't hear a lot anymore.
Yeah, that's definitely one as well. Yeah.
That's God's wounds is where that comes from.
Right.
Zounds. Yeah. So minced oath. Yeah, that is awesome. I've never heard that one before. I mean, I've heard examples of it, but I never knew what to call it.
Right.
But it makes sense because you're cutting it up, you're chopping it, you're rearranging it to where it's not as
right.
offensive as it normally would be.
Right.
Well, fudge me. That's interesting, Bryan. What a great
Shut
term.
the front door.
Cool. Minced oath. I'm gonna get into a subject here that requires at least 3 parts, but I'm pushing for 3 to keep things going. I'm keeping an eye on the clock because I want to talk to you, Bryan, about the CBI. If I were to ask you to rattle off the names of important generals from World War II on the American side of things, can you rattle off a few names of generals for me?
MacArthur, Eisenhower, Patton must have been World War II as well, right?
Yep. That's 3 I would name.
Right.
Bradley, maybe if you're stretching for one.
Nimitz. Well, no, that was Admiral.
Well, I'm going to throw another name in the pot here in a moment as I talk about the CBI. The CBI stands for the China-Burma-India Theater of World War II. And this was where the Chinese forces under the command of Chiang Kai-shek were fighting against the Japanese forces. And the role that America played and Britain played in helping China in their defense of Burma, clearing out Burma, and clearing out parts of China. So in the next three parts, I'm going to introduce to you three different folks who played parts in this particular conflict, in this theater of war. Because when we were in high school, we were taught about the European theater of war and the Pacific theater.
Right.
And we don't really talk about things like what happened in North Africa. I mean, sometimes we do, but those don't get a lot of play. And I don't think this one ever did. Right. So I'm going to go over a brief timeline and then get into kind of the conditions of the CBI and talk a little bit about a very important fellow who was in charge of this entire crazy mess. The Japanese Imperial forces invaded Manchuria in 1931. And of course, China and Japan have had conflicts for years, right? I mean, decades, going back centuries. And this latest invasion occurs in 1931. Chiang Kai-shek orders the creation of what's called the Burma Road, a road that's connecting Burma and China in terms of being able to get supplies into China over an inland route. He says, let's open that up in 1937. In December of 37 comes something you've probably heard of, the Rape of Nanking, which was the Chinese capital from December of 37 to mid-January of 38. 50,000 Japanese troops murdered or tortured over 300,000 people in Nanking, taking over the city. It was, when they say the Rape of Nanking, that's not exaggeration. Women were gang raped regularly. Men were taken out and bayoneted for bayonet practice. Right. On one day alone, 20,000 men were marched out into a field, into a mass grave, and basically just machine gunned down and tossed into a mass grave. It's one of the biggest atrocities, single day atrocities of World War II. And from 38 to 41, China slowly but effectively is cut off from the outside world by the Japanese forces, with a lone exception being the Burma Road to get supplies into them, particularly when they lost their final seaport. So they've cut off the sea, they've cut off land routes. All that's left is the Burma Road. Pearl Harbor occurs December 7th, 1941, which gets the American forces involved. America loses the bulk of its Pacific fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In 1941, December of that year, later in December 23rd to be specific, the first successful trip flying over the Himalayas, which was nicknamed the Hump, to get supplies into China occurs. This is going to become important in part 3. I'll come back to the Hump later. But for the purposes of this chapter, a man by the name of General Joseph Stilwell is put in command of the CBI in February of 1942. And that's who this episode is really about, that and the CBI itself.
Okay.
Stilwell was born in 1883 in Florida, but he was raised in Yonkers, overlooking the Hudson River, went to West Point, served in the Philippines in World War I, but he really had administrative roles. He saw a little bit of combat in World War I at Verdun, but he was really a great organizer, a great thinker. He served 3 different posts in China between the world wars as kind of an attaché. He learned the Chinese language, a couple of them. He learned the customs, he learned about the history of China, and really opened up China to kind of the world in between the world wars. He was remanded to Fort Benning, where he was known as a ferocious tactician in war games. He was extremely inventive. He was also a peerless instructor. He was a hell of a teacher. Like he would truly embody the idea of see one, do one, teach one, where he would get down and show a cadet how to fire their rifle properly from all positions.
Right.
He was considered for command in the African campaign that eventually went to Eisenhower, but it was determined that he was a better fit for the China-Burma-India theater. It was seen as a lesser post, but with all of his experience in China, George Marshall said, this is the guy, and Marshall trusted him, and he trusted Marshall. So Stilwell said, I will go where I am commanded. So Stilwell, who's a 2-star general at the time, was put in command of the CBI in February of 42. Now, what was it like fighting in the China-Burma-India theater? Well, it was a mess. There's a comic strip from the 30s and 40s called Terry and the Pirates, which is widely considered to be one of the greatest comic strips ever by Milton Caniff. from The Complete Terry and the Pirates, Volume 5, which details the stories of some of the pilots that fought in the China-Burma-India theater. From The Complete Terry and the Pirates, Volume 5, 43 to 44, there's an essay by Bruce Canwell, and he sums it up really, really nicely. The ground war in the China-India-Burma theater was a slow and costly one. The physical challenges of thick jungles, rugged terrain, and unpredictable weather were further complicated by disagreements among American, Chinese, and British tactical leaders over the best way to confront the Japanese forces. Now, I'm not going to go into every single campaign of this war because that's not what this is about. I'm more interested in the people who worked within it, but I'm going to give some great sources if people want to read more about that. In Donovan Webster's, which is to me the definitive resource, called The Burma Road, Brits and Americans came to say that the CBI stood for Confused Bastards in India and Confused Beyond Imagination. Because not only were you dealing with terrain, you're dealing with a tropical climate, in many cases, jungles. Right. So you're dealing with severe amount of illnesses. For example, Lieutenant Sam Wilson had concurrent, he had them all at once, diagnosed cases of mite typhus, malaria, infected jungle sores, most likely caused by leeches, amoebic dysentery, nervous exhaustion, and starvation-related wasting. He eventually recovered from all of them, where he earned the title and nickname of the sickest man in World War II. So at any given time, you could get one of these diseases and it could take you out for weeks.
Right.
And at one point, one of the forces was down 80% because all of them had developed malaria. You could get sick at any given time. Webster's book, The Burma Road, also has some input from the other side. There's a Japanese Imperial Army private named Atsumi Oda, who kept a very detailed diary. And his detachment was out on patrol one night in the jungle where they lost one of their men and the man was heard screaming. He was on patrol and the scream was heard in the jungle and he was not seen alive again. His partial remains were found 2 miles away up in a tree. A tiger had been stalking his party. Right. A tiger or several tigers would stalk and kill many men in Oda's detachment throughout the war, but no tiger was ever killed by that detachment. So you're fighting the jungle, you're fighting disease, right, and you're fighting tigers.
Right.
So Stilwell is put in command of this particular area. Here's some of the duties that he had. Some of the duties. He was the commander of the U.S. Army forces in the China-Burma-India theater. He was the chief of staff to China's supreme commander, Chiang Kai-shek, whom he did not get along with. They did not like each other. Stilwell referred to him as his code name, which was Peanut. So he would refer to him as the GMO for Generalissimo or Peanut, derisively.
Right.
He was the supervisor of the land lease program, which is the way that we would give, before we got in the war, we gave supplies to Britain to help them out fighting Germany. We did the same thing with China. Okay, so he's the supervisor of this land lease program. He was the U.S. representative on any war council that was formed in the CBI. No matter whether the British formed it or the Americans formed it, he had to be on the war council. He had to maintain the Burma Road, which had been cut in half by the Japanese. He had to train, not personally, but he had to oversee the training of 2 million Chinese troops. He had to focus on getting an air supply, not the band, but the air supply of cargo over the hump, the Himalayas. He had to work on another project of building a second road called the Lido Road from India that would connect with the Burma Road. And later on in the war, he was the deputy commander to Lord Mountbatten in what was called the SEAC, the Southeast Asia Command. At one point, he was involved in 3 different command structures, to the point where in one command structure, he was the superior to an officer, but in another one, that same officer was his superior. So they would meet and say, do you have any orders for me, sir? No, I do not. Do you have any orders for me? No, I do not. That's how tangled and complicated it was for him. Now, these roads that were being built or repaired in Burma and Lido, Colonel Charles Gleim, who was the commander, and I hope I'm saying that name right, the commander of the U.S. 330th Engineers in Lido, said that the Lido Road would be the toughest engineering job on the planet, coming out of India into China. Gleim had been the project supervisor for 3 very minor engineering projects in the New York City area. Gleam worked on the Lincoln Tunnel, which connected Midtown Manhattan to Weehawken, New Jersey.
Right.
The Holland Tunnel, which connects Lower Manhattan to Jersey City, and the George Washington Bridge, which connects Manhattan to Fort Lee, New Jersey. That's pretty impressive.
Right.
And here this guy is saying, this is going to be a tough job. Okay. So we've got the land part addressed. The other problem is that of the hump. And I'm going to talk more about the hump in part 3. The hump used a variety of ships piloted out of India through Burma over the Himalayas into China. They used C-47s, C-46s, B-24 bombers. The big bombers were retrofitted into cargo transports, and they were rechristened C-87s. And then you had C-109s that carried nothing but fuel. There'll be more on this later because I'm doing a story exclusively on one of the pilots in part 3. There was also a group, because remember he worked with a bunch of British officers as well. There was a fellow by the name of Wingate, who was a British officer. And these folks that worked with Wingate were called Chindits. And the Chindits were a group of Burma natives. And it's hard to say they were Burmese because Burma was made up of a variety of different ethnic groups.
Sure, right.
So I'll just call them a group of Burma natives. And Wingate was a character unto himself. This was a guy who would not bathe. He instead preferred just to scrub his body down with a hard brush. That was his idea of bathing. He would spend weeks out in the jungle with these guys. They were guerrilla fighters of the highest order. There was a rumor that one night a Chindit was asleep in a tree trying to get some rest when 4 Japanese soldiers slept under the tree trunk, and one by one he slipped down and cut their throats in the middle of the night and just went back to sleep in the tree. They were tough dudes. They like to use knives, and what they would do is they would slice the throat of soldiers and then take both their ears, cut their ears off. And
Why?
well, according to this book, The Burma Road, the reason they did it is because it was their understanding that in certain religions, when you go to heaven, you are tugged into heaven by your ears.
Uh-huh.
So if they take the ears, you can't go to heaven.
Okay.
Stilwell wanted to meet with one of these warriors, the guy that was kind of the liaison between Wingate and the rest of the crew. And he said, is it true that you guys are as efficient as you say? And the guy pulled out a little bag and opened the bag and dumped it. And there's these little lump-sized dried apricot kind of things on the table.
All ears.
And they were all ears. And he said, you want to know how many men I've killed? Count that up and divide it by 2. That'll tell you how many men I've killed. So Stilwell was like, yeah, I think we can use these guys. They're pretty effective, but please stop taking the ears. There's no indication that they actually stopped taking the ears, but he said, stop taking the ears.
Right.
Wingate probably deserves his own story because he was quite the character in terms of like his attitude. So he's dealing with Wingate and the Chindits. He's also got another general by the name of Claire Chennault and the Flying Tigers. Probably heard of these guys.
Mm-hmm.
A ragtag bunch of pilots who were fighter pilots. They didn't wear uniforms. Like there was one guy that was known to wear his cowboy boots and a cowboy hat when he fought. These guys were under the command of Chennault starting in 1942. Now, he made an argument throughout the war that China was only going to be taken back and Burma was only going to be taken back in an air war. And he would often side with Chiang Kai-shek against Stilwell. So while Chennault was an ally and part of the reason that China eventually was taken back, he was also kind of a thorn in the side of Stilwell because you would not, they were because Stilwell's argument was, no, it's got to be a land war. We've got to take the land back if we're going to have any hope of holding on to this for the future. And Chiang Kai-shek, as I said earlier, did not get along with Stilwell, never did. But Chiang Kai-shek was also dealing with the fact that while he was busy with the Japanese invaders, he was also dealing with the communist army under the control of Mao Zedong. So Chiang Kai-shek has his hands full too. So there's just this boiling mess everywhere you look. When Stilwell took command, I'm going to ask this because this might be his finest moment, and it was very early in his command. The first thing Stilwell did, not the first thing, he was there about 6 weeks when this happened. He had to retreat. He had to take 115 people back through the jungles and get out of China into India. It's called the March to India. From reporting World War II, Stilwell's retreat, May 1942, an excellent reporter by the name of Jack Belden writes a very compelling piece called Flight Through the Jungle, where Stilwell gets everybody together in a group and organizes them and says, okay, we need to pool our food and our rations and our clothes. We're short on shoes, but if you have clothes and someone else needs a jacket, give it to them if you have an extra jacket. In no uncertain terms, we are going to get through this together. If we don't act together, we're not going to make this. Stilwell, at one point, this is from Webster's book, calls out an anonymous officer for an overloaded bedroll. He cut it open and it had extra pillows in there and an air mattress. And he's like, yeah, this can't continue. And he didn't call the guy out. He says, I'm not going to call him out personally because he feels the shame right now. But anybody else who pulls this, you're out. You're on your own. And he stormed off. And Stilwell never wore a helmet or a traditional officer's hat. He wore his old battered hat from World War I, a flat brimmed hat that he always wore. And it looked like it'd been through a war. And it led one soldier, as Stilwell was stomping off, to say, geez, even his old hat looks mad at us. And that's one of the reasons his nickname was Vinegar Joe, because he was a very salty, acidic kind of guy.
Right.
115 people, including civilians, refugees, nurses, and doctors and wounded, left this part of China. 115 arrived in India alive. He got them all there, not a single loss. Once they got there, Stilwell said, okay, we got that done. Now we need to go back and retake Burma. And I'm not going to tell you how that happens because that would take too long. And that's the point of the Burma Road and some other books. And I don't want to take away their thunder, but it's a long and prescribed battle that lasts 2 years to get this portion of the war under control. But I will say that by May of 1944, Stilwell was starting to feel really tired. I mean, he was 61 years old. He found that he had little strength or wind. He was in a fair amount of pain most of the time. He was starting to feel like a guy who had been at war basically for a long time, and he was in his 60s. By September of 44, communist forces in China agree to fight against the Japanese. They'll take the land north of the Yellow River. Everybody else is going to fight south of the Yellow River. But one of the conditions of this is that Stilwell has to go. Despite all that he's done, Chiang Kai-shek says it's time for Stilwell to leave. Everybody's kind of against him at this point. I'm really not sure why, except he would not tell people what they wanted to hear. He would tell them the truth. He was an honest dude.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons his men loved him so much. And one of their nicknames for him was Uncle Joe. It was Vinegar Joe and Uncle Joe. Because again, when they marched out, he was at the head of the line. He never wore his general's insignias. One guy commented that he looked like a duck hunter when he was out in the field. In October of 1944, he was transferred back to Washington. He had to be replaced by 2 separate generals for his workload. 2 separate people took his place. In February of 1945, so 6 months or so, 5 months or so after he left, the Burma-Lido Road had been connected and it was officially opened. And Chiang Kai-shek renamed it the Stilwell Road. And Stilwell's not quite sure why he did that. He's like, he hated my guy. I don't know why. He wasn't mad. He was just kind of like, what was that about?
Like, okay, whatever.
Stilwell is eventually reassigned to Okinawa in June of 1945. So he goes home and then he's recalled to duty. He took command of the 10th Army after the general in charge of that is killed in duty. And there was one thing that he heard as he was returning into camp. And he said that it has made him as happy as anything else that had happened to him through the course of his career. He was passing some soldiers. He was in a Jeep and he was driving along and some soldiers are working on a trench or digging a hole or something. And one of the soldiers shot up and just yelled out, "Hey guys, Joe's back." And that made him incredibly proud because he was always there for his men and they were there for him. Retold in the Webster book, a newspaper called The Roundup, which focused on the CBI theater, an excellent writer wrote this of Stilwell. Someday, when this war is only a filthy memory, the whole story of Stilwell in Asia will be told. The epic of an unpretentious man who went forth sword in hand and slew the dragons of adversity in their dens. On October 3rd of 1946, after the war was over, Stilwell had some exploratory surgery where metastatic cancer is found throughout his body, including his liver and his stomach, explaining the incredible pain he'd been in for years.
Wow.
He had earned the Legion of Merit, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Distinguished Service Medal, 4 General Stars, but he had never earned a very simple medal that most combat infantrymen earn early in their careers, and it's called the Combat Infantryman Badge. He was awarded this final distinction on October 11th, just 8 days after his surgery. And the general who corralled the madness that was the CBI died the following day, October 12th, 1946. I too hope that when we look back on this, and I think Donovan Webster's book, The Burma Road, is astonishingly great at doing this, we realize how important Stilwell was to the war effort, how he's a guy who gave everything he had to his command, to the men under his command, and to his commitment to bringing liberty to China at a very difficult time, despite limited resources, limited support from certain people.
Right, sure.
And did an astonishing job in a short amount of time with a whole lot on his plate. The sources for this piece are Donovan Webster's magnificent The Burma Road from 2003. If you want to know more about the ins and outs, complete with cool maps showing the different movements of troops, check that book out, The Burma Road. The Complete Tearing the Pirates, Volume 5, 1943 to 1944, in an essay called Sitting the Stage by Bruce Canwell. And Reporting World War II, American Journalism, 1938 to 1946, Jack Belden's essay, Stilwell's Retreat, May 1942, Flight Through the Jungle, and good old Wikipedia for basic dates and information. And that concludes part 1 of the CBI.
Nice. Very, very cool.
Yeah, and in the next
interesting story.
It is, and in the next story, you're going to meet a doctor, and in the final part, you're going to meet a pilot who flew over the hump. So you've got a couple more very interesting characters to meet in parts 2 and 3.
Yeah, very cool. I'd heard of Stilwell, obviously, many times, but knew comparatively little about him. So yeah, super interesting stuff.
Yeah, he was cut from a different ream of cloth. I mean,
yeah. I mean,
wow.
There just are. It seems like there are some people from history at various stages. I mean, Churchill must have been like this as well. Just one of those types that just, from the get-go, shot out of the cannon with a certain type of gravitas and personality that they just got stuff done.
Yeah, I think Stilwell was absolutely that kind of person. And the thing is that in the long run, he was right. It was a ground war that would have to retake Burma and China. He was right about a lot of stuff. He was right about the fact that, look, the Chiang Kai-shek, that's not going to last. China's going to fall to the communists eventually. He was right about that. He was right about just about everything that he did. Anyway, if you read The Burma Road, you'll meet a lot of more interesting characters. Wingate, I didn't even get into General Slim, General Pick, a whole bunch of these other folks who are over there trying to make sense of, in my mind, what was the most confusing and maddening theater of war in World War II.
Right, sure. Yeah, awesome.
Oh,
super interesting.
Didn't even talk about the elephant. There was a British soldier who got separated from his group, and he was stalking up a trail, and he came face to face with an elephant that was just standing there munching some greens in the middle of the trail, just looking at him. And he looks down and sees that he's got a little hobble around his foot, and he realizes that it's one of the transport elephants they used in their retreat in 42. And he's just been out in the jungle eating, and so he's like, I'm not sure. And the elephant kind of looked at him like, hey, I think I know you. And so the guy said, I'm just going to go around this elephant, 20 yards this way and cut back on the trail later on. So you have tigers and elephants and all kinds of things wandering on the trail.
Oh my.
Yeah. Oh my.
All right. Well, there you have it, folks.
Yep. Sounds good.
Part 1 of the CBI. Thanks for listening. We'll be back again soon. Like and subscribe and share and do all those good things, and let us know what you think.
the ITP, the CBI. It's a DWII podcast. Thanks for listening. Thanks, Bryan, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.